My name is Mara Ellison and I am 66. 4 nights a week I work the late shift in the palliative wing at Harborview, the hospital that faces the gray water in Rock Harbor, Maine. I warm hands, smooth sheets, listen when voices thin to a thread. It isn't glamorous. It is steady. Most people only want a hand to hold until the room grows quiet. I have been that hand for years. When you live at the edges, useful, gentle, you begin to fade there too. The night before my son's wedding, I met his fiancée in a parking lot behind the restaurant where the rehearsal dinner was already laughing. I carried a wrapped bundle that felt heavier than cotton should a patchwork quilt I'd been sewing all winter pieced from scraps of our life. A corner of the dish towel from Lucas's first apartment, a strip from his debate blazer, a square cut from the pillowcase he insisted on taking to camp. Her name is Sienna Park. She stepped outside, hair pulled tight, lipstick dark. She smiled the way you smile at a delivery that isn't yours, polite, already reaching for the return. "Mrs. Ellison," she said. "That's thoughtful." She glanced into the bag and let the tissue fall back. Then she stepped close enough that the music from inside couldn't swallow her words. "After tomorrow, please don't call us family," she said, careful as a contract. "Lucas and I are building something new. I need clean edges." I didn't argue. The air left my body so quickly it felt like a trick. The bag shifted. I tightened my hold because I am not someone who drops things, not even when someone else wants me to. Behind her, my son's laugh lifted and joined the happy room that made it. I drove home the long way and still passed my street. I set the quilt on the couch, turned on the sink lamp, and boiled water for tea. The clock above the stove ticked with a feline tail, a joke gift from a nurse who says I make night shift feel like afternoon. The dress I planned to wear hung on the bedroom door, a dusk lavender column I had altered by hand. Lucas once told me that color looked like sunrise on me. I didn't try it on. I sat at the kitchen table, cupped the mug, traced the saucer's ridge with my thumb, until the tea went cold. The house had the kind of quiet that magnifies small noises. The heaters click, a car drifting past on wet asphalt, the refrigerator sighing. My phone buzzed and settled a cousin about parking the venue's reminder, a bridesmaid's number I didn't recognize. I put the phone face down and went to the living room. The quilt waited where I'd left it, its seams imperfect in the way true things are. I folded it again and slid it into the cedar chest, not because I was finished, but because I needed to put something gentle away before I broke it. I slept in pieces. When I woke, I imagined the sanctuary I would not see the aisle runner a planner chose place cards that made strangers look important. At 5, I fed the kettle and ate toast over the sink, the way I did when Lucas was little and mornings were races. By 7, the neighborhood began its rehearsed noises, a snowblower 3 houses down, a gull on the wire, a dog that only barks at the mail. I dressed in jeans and a navy cardigan and braided my hair. The lavender dress stayed on the door, hopeful and out of place. At 8:30, the call started in earnest. "Where are you from?" A number I didn't save, running late. Text back from someone with an initial. I answered none. I would not attend a ceremony I had been asked to remove myself from. There is a kind of obedience that looks like love until you watch it take your seat. A firm, rapid knock sounded at 9:10. Agnes Bloom from next door stood on my porch in her Sunday suit, heather gray low shoes. She is 72 and observant in the way of retired librarians. She looked at me at the dress on the door over my shoulder at the kettle, just beginning to murmur. "You're not going," she said. "No," I said. She kept to the mat as if it were a boundary both of us needed. Her gaze slid to the cedar chest. "Is it finished?" "Almost." She squeezed my forearm with the steady hand of someone who once calmed a town by knowing where every book lived. "Sometimes staying home is the right thing." Then she crossed back to her porch. I closed the door and leaned against it, palms flat. The kettle began its thin, urgent whistle. I poured water over a fresh bag of Earl Grey and watched the steam curl in the light. When you ease people through endings long enough, you notice how steam and breath twin each other and then separate. I didn't cry. I tried to see if it would ease the pressure behind my eyes. Nothing came. I turned the phone over and read the messages from Lucas. He still writes Mom with a capital when he is nervous, as if the title could steady us both. Photos at 11:01 said, "Text when you're close." Another, "The florist needs a corsage count." The last, "all good." I typed nothing. I put the phone where the light didn't reach and wrapped both hands around the mug. Maybe I should have answered to spare him the looking, because he would look, but answering would make it smaller than it was. You cannot RSVP to erasure. At 10, the bells from St. Bridget's floated across town in 3 clear strokes. I listened. At noon, the bells marked the hour again, and in that same breath, the thing everyone had rehearsed did not happen. I know this not because I was there, or because a stream of calls told me so, but because the town's silence changed like a held note finally allowed to end. I sat at the table with a fresh cup and looked toward the bedroom. The lavender dress hummed in the corner of my eye like a thing plugged in. I thought about Sienna's request about Lucas's laugh sliding through a room that wasn't mine, about the sensation of holding a weight meant for joy. And then another thought, uglier, closer, pressed forward. The hurt in me wasn't only from being told to step aside. It was from knowing my son had not asked anyone to make room for me. I said it aloud in the kitchen with no one to hear. The sentence tasted bitter and correct. The day brightened. Light poured through the lace curtain in small lozenges. I washed the mug and set it down and breathed the way I tell patients, to low and slow, as if filling a jar from the bottom. A thought as thin as a stitch arrived not from outside but from the quiet part of me that takes its time. You were right to stay. It wasn't armor. It wasn't triumph. It sat down in my chest and took its place. I stood a while without moving. The house held. The clock tail flicked. I tied on an apron and wiped a counter that didn't need wiping, and felt in the smallest measurable way returned to myself. By early afternoon, the kitchen had warmed and the mug left a faint ring I wiped without looking. The house held steady around me, quiet in the way of places that have already made up their minds. I stood there and let the air move through my chest until another memory rose, months before Sienna's request in the parking lot, back when everything still wore its first coat of shine. The first night Lucas brought her over, I made chicken pie, because that was what used to anchor him after hard days, thyme and cream under a crimped crust, the kind that flakes if you breathe at it wrong. I set the table with the white plates that have blue vines around the rim. I bought them at a church fair the summer Lucas was 8, and convinced we needed fancy dishes to be a proper home. I ironed napkins, put the tulips from the supermarket in a mason jar, and opened the screen door to let the smell out into the yard. Sienna arrived exactly at 6. A car I didn't recognize idled at the curb long enough for a driver to step out, open her door, close it again without sound. She stepped into my little foyer with that city briskness people wear like a coat. Her dress was the color of bottled ink, and her earrings caught the light just to show they knew how. "Mara," she said, shaping my name as if tasting it for a note that didn't belong. "Thank you for having me." She hugged me without contact, and as she pulled back, her eyes took a small inventory. Frame lamp, frayed edge of the runner, Lucas's grade school photo wall. "This is quaint," she said, not unkind, and not the opposite of unkind either. Just a word that sorted me into a box on a shelf, whose labels she had written in advance. In the kitchen I asked sweet tea or plain. It was a reflex. This house makes sweet tea, the way some houses keep a piano tuned. "Plain," she answered quickly. Then, with the smile of someone who knows how to soften a "no, I'm avoiding sugar just now." "My nutritionist has me on an anti-inflammatory protocol before the wedding." It's silly. She did not take any when I said it in front of her anyway. We ate. She lifted the top crust carefully, as if the food held a hidden mechanism, and set each bite precisely where bites go. She told me about her work brand architecture campaigns rolled out across 3 continents, an investor dinner in Singapore that ended at a rooftop pool. Lucas, who has never met a rooftop pool, looked at her like she'd brought one in her bag. When I asked what she does when she isn't working, she said she tries to keep up with calls, mentors, clients, a mastermind group, her trainer. Then, as if to prove she could ask a question too, "How long have you been at Harborview?" The way she said the word Harborview, clean and clipped, told me she had Googled the hospital, but would not visit it unless someone she knew was photographed doing charity there. 22 years, I said. "That's steady," she said, and turned back to Lucas. "Oh, tell her about the campaign with the champagne brand. He did like he was telling me a story about a superhero I was finally allowed to meet." She did not ask where Lucas learned to argue, so I did not tell her about his 5th grade district debate final on school lunches. How he stood too small behind a wooden podium that swallowed him and held his voice together like a fist. She did not ask why the photo wall had a gap in the middle, so I did not tell her that was where his father's portrait used to sit, until grief loosened the frame and it fell and the glass cut my thumb, and I decided we were done saving everything that hurt to touch. When they left, Lucas hugged me longer than usual and whispered, "Thanks for trying the way you do when you think someone has done you a favor by liking the person you love." Summer carried us into his birthday. Since he was 10, I have made the same cake because you do not tinker with a compass, a dark sheet cake baked in a pan that has a dent on one corner and a gloss on the other, from years of butter cooled on the porch rail, then frosted with salted peanut butter icing and a little chocolate drizzle I call a flourish, and no one corrects me. I piped Happy 33 Lou because I ran out of space the year he turned 16, and the joke stuck, and I set a ridiculous plastic dinosaur on the corner because it makes him laugh, even when he is pretending to be a man who does not laugh at plastic dinosaurs. I brought it to their apartment that evening, balancing the pan in a cake carrier on my forearm. The elevator smelled faintly of eucalyptus and new paint. Their place had a carefully careless look, linen that never wrinkles books, whose spines were all chosen for the color of their jackets. Sienna opened the door with a glass of something sparkling. "You're an angel," she said. She cleared a space on the marble island and set my cake next to a low white cylinder box with a gold mark pressed into the lid. "From Patisserie Show," she said, tapping the lid with one finger so the logo flashed. "Hazelnut praline with a mirror glaze. They flew in the Feuilletine 2 days ago." She lifted the lid to show me a perfect thing that reflected the pendant light like a lake. "Isn't it a dream?" "It is," I said, because it was. After dinner, she gathered people in the living room and tapped her glass and declared it time. She went straight for the white cake box. Lucas smiled with pride in her precision. "Do we—" He started turning toward me, then stopped. Sienna's hand rested on his sleeve. "He's on a program," she told the room and me as if we were one thing. "No refined sugar for 6 weeks before the suit fitting. We are being disciplined," she laughed. The room laughed with her, polite and buoyed by the way she made discipline sound like a party trick. "But please, everyone indulge. We have options." She gestured generously to both cakes and cut the bakery ones so cleanly the piece stood at attention. Later, while someone played a playlist that never once admitted it was a playlist, I wrapped my cake in foil and slid it back into the carrier because food that is not eaten in front of you can still comfort you after you put your coat on. In the elevator, I held the carrier against my ribs like a sleeping child, and at home I set it on my counter and turned off the light. In the morning, I cut a square for myself and ate it at the table with a quiet fork. The cake tasted the way it always tastes. I did not. The planning gathered speed as summer leaned toward fall. An email from an address I did not recognize thanked me for expressing interest in contributing florals and attached a vision board I had not seen. A text from Lucas said he'd looped me into the group chat, and for 1 hour I was in a thread labeled L Hearts S the Build, and then the thread went on without me. When I asked Sienna lightly about the tasting, she said, "We're doing a lean process, fewer voices, less friction. We'll send you a link to the final menu so you have everything." "I can drive," I said. "I don't need to weigh in." "Of course," she said, "but we've got it." A week later, a photograph appeared on my phone forwarded from a cousin who follows people I do not know. Sienna in a dress the color of clean snow fitted like a promise surrounded by women in blush silk holding coupe glasses. The caption read, "Found the one." There are many ones in a dress shop and none of them were me. When I asked Lucas how it went, he said, "I thought Sienna invited you. It all moved fast." I nodded into the phone, which is how you shake your head when you do not want the sound of it recorded. I offered a song list because Lucas grew up on Sam Cooke and Otis Redding and voices that move time across a room. Beautiful, Sienna texted. "We're going modern to keep the floor alive, but maybe as texture during cocktail hour." Texture, I learned, is what you call a thing when you like it, but would rather not see it. "Where should I sit?" I asked, thinking only of shoes. "Front of house will seat you," she wrote. "Just arrive, shine, and let us carry the details." Carry is what planners do for you when they don't want you to lift anything at all. If you want to know when a relationship changes, check the calendar squares whose handwriting they are in and where your name stops appearing. It was not that I was excluded. It was that I was managed. The difference is subtle if you are not paying attention and loud if you have ever been a mother. I went back to work to night corridors that smell of antiseptic and talc, to a man who wanted to hear the Red Sox game again, even though the season had ended and he wanted the part with the double in the eighth, to a woman who watched a nature show with the sound off and said the word green as if it were a prayer. I tucked blankets over shins and lifted a straw to lips and charted numbers that prove bodies are still here. At 4 a.m, the monitors dimmed themselves for mercy. I learned a long time ago that the quiet just before dawn is where truth sits and waits for you to admit you hear it. There were other small edits. A consultation about linens that became a spreadsheet I was not sent. A question I had about readings at the ceremony, even if mine were never chosen, I wanted to offer, to which Sienna replied, "We're avoiding anything that makes the energy heavy. Somehow the scriptures that buried my husband and held up my son were heavy." I did not argue. I moved my fingers along the edge of the kitchen counter, a groove carved by decades of plates going out and back, and thought about edges and who gets to decide where they are. I stitched the quilt in the evenings because sewing has always been the one work in this house that makes quiet louder and kinder at the same time. I added squares I had never planned to include flannel from the pajama pants Lucas wore in college until the knees went white, a corner from a tea towel we stained with marinara, the year we learned to make sauce that didn't taste like the jar or the cuff of a shirt his father wore to a fundraiser, where we stood outside on a balcony and pretended to be people with a plan. On the back, I stitched a thin strip of sky blue cotton I bought for no reason one spring, thinking someday I would need courage in that color. The night before the rehearsal dinner, I stayed up late to tack down the binding. My eyes stung and I pricked my finger once and watched a dot of red swell and then disappear into the fabric as if the cloth had a mouth for such things. In the morning, the quilt lay over the arm of the couch, ready in the way objects can be ready when people are not. At the bistro, brick walls, bulbs strung in lines as if dates could be held up with wire voices rose and fell in practiced loops. I carried the brown paper bag with the quilt nested in tissue and ribbon. Sienna met me at the door, already smiling, already moving me toward the edge of the room. She peered into the bag and smoothed the tissue as if ironing it with her palm. We stepped into that small pocket of parking lot air where music turns thin and words grow their true shapes, and she gave me her sentence, exact and polished. After I drove home, I set the bag on the couch and sat without turning on the light. That was the night I learned a house can decide to keep you company. Now in the middle of the day, I looked at the cedar chest and then at my hands. They did not shake. I thought about the cake I had eaten alone and the Sam Cooke song that would not live anywhere near a dance floor, and the way Sienna used the word we as if there were no room inside it for me. None of this surprised me, not really. It was the accumulation that hurt like thread pulled one more time through a tired hole. The phone face down beside the stove trembled once and settled. Outside, somewhere beyond the maple at the end of the drive, a gull called toward the harbor, that long falling sound that seems to come from the throat of the town itself. I rinsed the mug, set it upside down on the towel, and smoothed my palm over the linen as if it were a rowdy child's hair. In the living room, the afternoon light lay across the cedar chest like a stripe. I untied the ribbon and lifted the quilt out and laid it across my lap. It was heavier than it looked and exactly as warm as it should be. The quilt was warm against my knees, dense with small histories. I smoothed a seam that refused to lie flat and listened to the house breathe. Outside, gulls rode the light. The harbor smelled faintly of salt and cold iron. The phone on the counter hummed, then stilled. I left it face down and let the quiet return. At 10:10, there was a knock. 3 light taps, the way people knock when they're carrying news rather than packages. I set the quilt aside and opened the door to my sister. Nora had pinned her hair on one side and missed a strand. It curled along her jaw like punctuation. She was in a dress the color of wet slate, the kind you wear to church when you aren't ready to see anyone. Her purse strap cut a line into her shoulder she hadn't noticed. Behind her, the street had the glazed look of a town that has dressed for a celebration and found no reason to leave the house. "Mara," she said, and that was all for a few seconds. I stepped back so she could come into the foyer and choose whether to move farther. She didn't. Her eyes were bright in that way that means the body is trying to hold its water. "The wedding's off," she said. I felt the sentence, then heard it. What happened? Nora's gaze drifted past me to the cedar chest, as if things that hold things could anchor us. One of Lucas's old college friends, Ben, the tall one who used to break your chairs, pulled him aside at the church. He had photographs, screenshots, hotel key receipts, Sienna with her creative director. She swallowed and added, "For months, some of it recent." I pressed my hand to the doorframe and left it there. It felt cool and ordinary. "Lucas called it right there," Nora said. "In the narthex?" He stepped outside, told the pastor there wouldn't be a ceremony, and then he left. Sienna followed him into the courtyard and said things. Nora's voice thinned on the last words, as if even repeating echoes might cut. People cried. Someone fainted. It was like watching a set collapse, but in slow motion. I angled my head until my neck found a point that did not hurt. He didn't call me. I don't think he's called anyone. We stood with the door half closed, like the house itself wasn't sure how much to admit. Finally, I said, "Thank you for telling me with your mouth and not a screen." Nora nodded. She set her hand lightly on my forearm. "Harborview taught you the calm I run to when there's a fire," she said with a sad little smile. "I'll be next door if you need me. I mean that." After she left, I leaned my forehead against the wood and breathed until the muscle under my left shoulder stopped twitching. I made tea. I poured it into the heavy white mug with a chip on the lip, the one that never burns my fingers, because maybe it has learned where pain belongs. I was not relieved. I was not vindicated. I was a hollowed-out instrument, and the room went still enough to hear the note I made. The day moved anyway. The bells at noon struck their clean metal and carried over the harbor. Somewhere a child laughed the way children laugh when adults forget they are present. The light changed its mind about the counters and moved to the floor, and I followed it with my eyes like a cat. The knock came again when the clock's tail made one full sweep. This time it was Lucas. He stood on the porch as if he had walked until he found the only door that would let him not perform. He looked older and not older at all, eyes blown open from too much looking mouth set, the way he sets it when he's trying not to apologize for something he didn't do. "Mama," he said, and the word landed in the room and made a place for itself. I moved aside. He came in without his coat, as if he'd misplaced what weather does. He sat at the edge of the couch where the quilt had been and kept his hands between his knees like he was holding them in place. His hair was still carefully cut, but the care had slid off the rest of him. "I drove," he said. "I don't know where. I just drove. I went to the linen closet and took down the old blue quilt. The one from winters when fevers needed a weight, the one that smells like cedar and laundry soap in long years. I draped it over his shoulders and his body recognized the gesture before he did. He leaned into it as if a string inside him had slackened. He stared at the hearth as though there were a fire to look at. Ben showed me his phone. He spoke as if the sentences were on the far side of a room and needed coaxing to cross. It was thorough. Sienna and Mason at the hotel on Broad at a cabin up near Haviland Pond in New York after the donor dinner. Messages. She told him, "I don't read attachments." She laughed. He shut his eyes briefly. I walked out. She followed me and she said, he made a short sound, not quite a laugh, not one. She said none of this would have happened if you hadn't made me soft. I sat in the chair opposite him. I put my hands in my lap to keep from reaching out to fix his hair like he was 8 and trying to part it by himself. He opened his eyes and found mine like someone finding level ground. I didn't call you, he said. It wasn't apology and it wasn't not apology. I didn't know what to say that wasn't a noise. You came, I said. He nodded. His mouth trembled once, small as a heartbeat. The quilt rose and fell at his collarbone. I let her. Place you, he said, and the word he chose was right. In a corner on a schedule in a box labeled heavy or quaint or managed. I told myself I was doing balance. I told myself you wanted it that way. I wanted to be who she said I could be, and that meant walking away from who I actually am. And then today happened and the floor I picked turned out to be a set. He had been practicing stillness. It broke. He covered his eyes with his hand and did not make a sound, and then he did, and it filled the room in a way nothing had, since he'd been small enough to fold into me completely. I moved to the couch and set my palm against the back of his head, the way you steady a bird before you open a window. He cried like his lungs had been keeping their own calendar and had reached a date. When he was finished, he took a breath that remembered how. He sat back. He tugged the quilt up as if cold were a thing the body could outrun. Do you want tea? I asked. Yes, he said, and the word had more letters than usual. In the kitchen, I warmed the kettle again because life insists on needing water. When I came back, he had his phone in his lap. The screen showed a photograph of Sienna in a white dress alone at the front of St. Brigid's mascara, streaked in artful lines, bouquet clenched. The caption said, "My wedding day stolen, some people cannot stand to let go of control." His jaw set. She's posting. Her friends are posting. A blog I've never heard of wrote a thing about a jealous mother who sabotaged an event. Ben says half the town has an opinion and none of them know anything. I set his tea down and clicked his screen dark. Let them do their loud, I said. We will do our true. His mouth bent. That sounds pretty mom, but the internet doesn't care about embroidery. I know, I said. Drink your tea. He did. He set the cup down with both hands as if you could set down a day that way. I thought that was the worst of it, until the back door creaked open without a knock, which is how Ruth Delgado enters when she's worried. She is a paralegal who retired twice and failed at it both times. She has shoulders like a harbor wall and a tote bag big enough to carry a week. There you are, she said to Lucas with relief that looked like scolding. You left the church like a magician. People tried to follow. I blocked them. You're welcome. Mara, do you have coffee? Actually, no tea. I'm too jittery. She dropped her tote on the table and pulled out a folder thick with paper and tabbed in colors. I called in favors I wasn't saving for anything prettier. Do not ask. She slid the top sheet toward me, an email printout. From Sienna at Park Strategies to Mason Vance at Subject Re next quarter. The sentence Ruth had underlined said, once the papers are signed, debt stops being a problem. He'll sign anything if I say it fast. Ruth tapped the next tab. Draft prenuptial agreement, not your standard mutual protection language. See paragraph 13. Her nail landed on a paragraph that looked ordinary until the third clause. In the event Party B, Lucas fails to maintain a standard of provision as reasonably defined by Party A Sienna, or otherwise creates an environment inconsistent with future joint ventures, all joint assets and specified non-joint assets shall transfer to Meridian Park Holdings, a limited liability company. Meridian Park is her father's company, Ruth said. It's operating in the red. They've been moving liabilities like deck chairs. Also note this reasonably defined by Party A. She writes the definition. He loses the house, the investments his grandfather left, anything held in his name if it intersects with the marriage. The clause on inconsistent with joint ventures is a little work of art. Lucas's hand tightened on the cup. He stared at the paper until the words aligned. I didn't see this, he said hollow. She said she wanted to sign something simple just before the license because her dad's attorneys are sticklers. Ruth nodded as if he'd confirmed the weather. Simple like a mousetrap. There are emails with her father's general counsel using phrases no counsel should ever put in print. I have them. Also, I spoke to Kay at Broad Street Venue, and she sent over a copy of a wire transfer Sienna tried to push through yesterday afternoon using your deposit in a corporate account. I cannot legally tell you how I obtained it, so I won't, but it exists. Lucas looked sick in that direct way honest men look sick when they discover a thing that required their consent to harm them. He set both hands flat on the table. Can we do anything? We can breathe, I said. We can put the papers in order. Ruth gave me a look that said we share a brain. The phone on the counter lit with an unknown number, and a message previewed itself like a small invitation. I don't answer unknowns, but the words caught me. I debated sending this, but I wiped my hands and opened it. Hello, Mrs. Ellison, you don't know me. My name is Alyssa Crane. I knew Sienna in the years after college work, then some social overlap. I followed the commotion today and almost kept quiet. Then I remembered her mother. Sienna treated her like an obstacle to climb, not a woman to love. I don't know your situation, but I'm sorry. She learned to win rooms. She never learned what to do with homes. I read it twice and put the phone down. It didn't explain anything. It made more sense of what needed none. Ruth had set up her little machine on the sideboard, a portable scanner she once called her pension. She fed the papers through as if laying cards carefully and let them appear on her laptop, which clicked softly with each page captured. Lucas stood. He paced once, twice, found the wall and leaned his shoulders there like he'd been holding the house up and didn't know when he'd started. I kept thinking discipline and modern and lean meant grown-up, he said to the paint. Turns out it meant don't ask questions. I treated you like text your mom. And then I watched a man hand me proof and realized I had been choosing a life someone else designed. I went to him, and because men who have been told to be sturdy need permission, I put my palm to his cheek and felt the evening stubble. You are here, I said. It was enough. He nodded once. He looked toward Ruth. Who does truth belong to? Ruth smiled with only one side of her mouth. To whoever keeps the receipts, she said, patting the stack. And to whoever doesn't flinch when they read them. We ate toast at the counter because food is what you put into the quiet when words begin to taste like metal. Ruth told a story about a judge who fell asleep during a hearing and woke at the exact right sentence to bang the gavel. Lucas laughed, then looked surprised to have done it. The internet kept doing what it does. Sienna's post gathered hearts and exclamation points and statements about boundaries from women who collect quotes about boundaries, the way other people collect spoons. A blog with a name like a kitchen appliance published a piece that used the words toxic and mother and control in a paragraph that managed to be both slander and poorly edited. Ben texted a photograph of the church parking lot where the flowers looked like they were waiting for a rehearsal that had gone home. Around dusk, the harbor light swept the room in its slow arc and colored the white wall amber. I took the finished squares of the quilt and stacked them in pairs. Lucas watched my hands and then reached for a needle as if it were a tool he might learn. The back door opened again, softer this time. Agnes slipped in and stood just inside like she had wandered into a page and wanted to figure out the point of view. I brought lemon bars, she said, from the good bakery. They're not on anyone's program. We ate those too with our fingers and dusted the sugar off the counter with the side of our hands. Ruth handed Lucas a flash drive. This is organized, she said. Subject lines, dates, accounts, transactions. If you decide to show it to someone who writes for a living, show it all, not pieces. Pieces can be explained away. Bodies of work speak for themselves. He closed his fingers around the plastic until the corners pressed little half-moons into his skin. Thank you, he said, for being exactly who you are on days like this. Ruth shrugged. I'm merely nosy and retired badly. When the house was quiet again and the sink was rinsed and dried and the kettle had cooled, Lucas stood by the window and watched the street. The maple has a habit of holding the last light in its highest leaves like it wants to keep one secret at night. He turned toward me with a face that had returned to its shape. I know who I am in this, he said. Not a headline, not a client, not a man who needs to look taller in photographs. He looked at the stack of papers, then at the quilt squares, then back at me. I'm going to tell the truth the way you taught detail on a chart clear without theater. He wasn't performing anything now. He was standing. The clock's tail flicked. The kettle ticked as it cooled. He reached for the blue quilt out of old habit and drew it around his shoulders. The house learned the new weight and held. The harbor bell sounded once low and definite, as if someone out at the point had chosen the moment for us and only then asked whether we agreed. By noon, a concierge in a navy blazer climbed our steps and said my son's name as if he were reading it off a plaque. He handed over a heavy envelope addressed in pewter ink, Mr. Lucas Ellison and guest. Inside a card, thick enough to stop a door, an invitation to a private conversation to resolve misunderstandings, signed by Ray Park and Yoon Mi Park at a rooftop suite overlooking the harbor. 8 o'clock tonight. Lucas looked at the card, then at the stack of papers Ruth had scanned and clipped. He did not ask me if I wanted to go. He said simply, "Come with me." We walked through air that smelled like tide and linen. I wore the sea glass dress I had kept for a day when I needed to remember I belonged in any room I entered. Ruth pressed a thin folder into my hands at the curb. "Same order as before. Don't rush." "Let the paper speak," she said, then stepped back into the dark and left us to the elevator. The suite had windows on 3 sides and a table set for 6 with too many forks. The sky held the last stripe of orange over the water. Sienna stood when we came in, hair low and neat face arranged in careful sorrow. Her parents rose more slowly. Ray Park's tie was the blue of business cards. His wife's expression was the kind people wear at galas when someone mentions a subject they don't fund. "Mara," Sienna said, using my name like an attempt at softness. "Lucas." She lifted her palms. "This has been a misunderstanding, spun out of grief. We can restore it if we all choose calm." Ray gestured to the chairs without sitting. "Before anything else, you will pull down whatever materials your associates have circulated. An apology will be acceptable. If not, you leave us no choice but to pursue remedies. The distress inflicted on my daughter is documented." Lucas didn't sit either. "No one posted anything from our side," he said even. "And distress is not a remedy for theft." The words stole a little air from the room. I placed Ruth's folder on the linen and opened it. I slid the first page across the print of an email subject line, next quarter, Sienna to her creative director. Underlined. "Once the papers are signed, debt stops being a problem. He'll sign anything if I say it fast." Unmi flinched so slightly I might have imagined it. Ray didn't blink. "Creative teams use shorthand," he said. "You are reading tone." I turned the next tab. The draft prenuptial agreement. I tapped clause 13 with one finger. "Assets transferring to Meridian Park Holdings upon definitions you control," I said, "including things you did not bring to the marriage." Ray's mouth thinned. Standard protections. "For whom?" Lucas asked. Sienna's voice sharpened. "We were building a venture. You said you wanted to be more decisive to grow. My father knows how. He was trying to protect us from small thinking." Lucas considered her like a person finally looking at a painting in daylight. "I wanted to grow," he said, "not become collateral." I slid one more document across the cloth, an approval screen capture for a wire transfer from the venue deposit to Meridian Park Holdings timestamped yesterday afternoon. "This should have waited until after a ceremony," I said. It did not. Sienna's jaw trembled. "That's out of context." "There's a great deal of context," I said. "Most of it has dates." Ray's palm flattened on the tablecloth. "You are manufacturing scandal, Ms. Ellison. Reputations will suffer, my attorneys." Lucas exhaled, not loud, but final. "You used me," he said to Sienna, not angry, not asking. "And when you needed a villain to distract from that, you named my mother." Sienna's eyes flashed toward me. "She made you soft." He shook his head once. "No, she made me able to walk out of wrong rooms." We did not sit. There was nothing left in the chairs we needed. I closed the folder and left it on the table because paper is heavier when you don't carry it alone. Lucas touched my elbow and we turned toward the glass doors. Behind us, Ray said something about consequences that dissipated before the city could hear it. The elevator was quiet except for the soft tick the panel makes when it counts down to ground. Lucas leaned his head back against the mirrored wall and shut his eyes, then opened them and looked at our reflections, 2 people made taller by glass. "I'm sorry," he said. "Not for this. For the months that arranged themselves like a path." I nodded. The door slid open. Morning came with fog sitting low over the harbor, the kind that hushes tires and turns gulls into white commas. I brewed coffee for Ruth and tea for myself. By 10, an independent outlet in Boston posted a straightforward footnoted piece with pagination and no adjectives, emails, contract excerpts, a timeline. No push alerts, no opinion. It read like minutes. I did not share it. I did not read the comments. Agnes brought a paper bag with scones and said only, "Still warm," and patted the door jamb like it was a shoulder and went back across the lawn. A nurse from Harborview texted a photograph of the unit's cat clock with a heart and on later covering for you if needed. I replied, "Thank you. I'm home." By mid-afternoon, the air had cleared to the kind of blue that makes houses look newly painted. Lucas wandered in and out of the kitchen, touching the stack of documents as if paper had a pulse. We ate the scones in halves and quarters. The kettle sang. The house remembered how to be a house. In the late light, we carried the quilt to the table. I threaded a needle with plum thread and set the label square where it belonged along the back edge. Lucas sat across from me, sleeves rolled, fingers clumsy in the way of someone learning a language you only speak with your hands. He did not tell me what he'd said to anyone. I did not ask. We worked until the binding lay smooth. He lifted the finished quilt and held it out so it could pour over his arms like water. "What do you put on the label?" he asked. I stitched the line I had written on a slip of paper and kept under the sugar canister since morning, not because I'd planned to use it, but because the words had come and were waiting their turn. I finished the last curve of the last letter and knotted the thread and smoothed it with my thumb. He turned the quilt and read, "For the ones who remain." He didn't say anything for a while. Then he folded the quilt in thirds the way I taught him when he was small, and blankets were tasks that gave hands purpose. He carried it to the cedar chest, and then, as if something had adjusted behind his eyes, he changed his mind, lifted it again, and took it to the car. We drove downtown with the windows cracked to let the salt through. His office sits above the seamstress's shop on Broad, where the mannequins in the window always look like they've just been told a secret. He unlocked the door and flicked on the lights. The room was the color of clean paper. On the far wall hung a framed map of the harbor and one empty space he had been saving for something he hadn't named. He held the quilt up and stepped back and then forward, measuring with his eyes. "Here," he said, and I could see it, how the squares would catch morning, how the stitching would make shadows that moved 12 hours apart. We hung it with care, 2 anchors sunk in clean plaster, a rail clips padded with felt. The quilt settled like a breath taken in and not let out until the right moment. A client had left earlier than planned. Her file waited on the desk in a neat stack. Lucas stood behind his chair and looked from the papers to the quilt and back again, as if calibrating the scale he would use for the rest of the day. "This helps," he said. "It knows how to." He turned off the lights and locked the door, and we walked down the narrow stairs past the seamstress humming to a radio. The air outside felt rinsed. We did not speak on the ride home. We didn't need to. That evening, Agnes sat on her porch with a book and lifted it in our direction like a toast. Ruth called to say she'd labeled one last folder for later and would drop it tomorrow with lemons because her tree had gone wild. I opened the kitchen window a few inches and let the harbor find its way into the room. When the house was dark, except for the lamp over the sink, I stood where I always stand with a mug cooling in my hands. Lucas came in barefoot and leaned a shoulder against the doorframe. He looked younger in the lamplight and exactly his age. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I live here," I said. It was answer enough. We let the quiet arrange itself. The foghorn out at the point sounded once the clock's tail kept its slow metronome, and the kettle ticked as it remembered heat. The day drew itself closed without theatrics. In the morning, the light would find the label's stitched line and read it again. For now, the harbor and the house and our 2 chairs agreed the room at last had its lights on. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story. I'll see you next time as we continue exploring more journeys and lessons together.